Okay, so very good morning, everyone. Can you hear me well?
Yes, doctor.
Thank you.
Yes, doctor.
Beautiful. Okay, so for today's class, you will be learning about species and speciation. What are the different concepts of species and how does it all occur? I believe some of you would have learned some these back in Form 5 or even, um, your upper Form 6. So let's see. You just guide me through, yeah, because I haven't sat through STPM. So it'll be nice to know feedback from you guys. Now, before I make you watch this video, I just like to clarify. This is what you guys are familiar, right, with the term of with species, where species are groups of actually or potentially interbreeding populations. Hence, they are reproductively isolated. So the fact that they are isolated, meaning to say they're separated, one group cannot reproduce with another group. Okay, and the output of it is that they will create fertile offsprings. Now the thing is, this is all what you've learned, right, in Form 6, betul tak? Or at least for matrix. Okay.
Yes.
Good. So this is what you've learned. But my purpose now explaining this course to you is that in terms of classification of species is very difficult and is very controversial. It is not a straightforward aspect because it is very species oriented. So I'm going to make you watch this video. So just stay tuned for this.
The average person on the street can probably tell you that cats and dogs are different species. And chances are they can come up with some reasons why. Cats and dogs look different. They behave differently. They don't make kitten-puppy hybrids. The same goes for squirrels and raccoons. We know intuitively that they're different species. But what about these squirrels? These trees? Turns out the squirrels are different species. The trees are the same species. But how do we know that? What is a species anyway? Depends on who you ask. If you ask a biologist, they might tell you that species are groups of interbreeding natural populations that are reproductively isolated from other such groups. Some would add the idea of potential to reproduce. For example, if two groups are separated by a barrier, but they could reproduce if they got together, then they're still the same species. An ecologist might give you a different definition. A species is a set of organisms adapted to a particular set of resources in the environment. Some might add that species have different physical characteristics or morphologies. Between these two concepts, we get something that's pretty broadly accepted across most of science. Sounds good, right? But in nature, things can get pretty fuzzy. For one, how meaningful is it that two groups have the potential to interbreed if they never meet in nature? Elk live in North America, and red deer live in Eurasia. In captivity, they can produce fertile offspring, but they could not possibly meet in nature. Stickleback fish live in isolated groups all across the northern hemisphere. Some groups look different, and they don't meet in nature, but they can reproduce in an aquarium tank. Second, some groups that everyone agrees are different species can interbreed. Take the polar bear and the grizzly bear. They look different, they live in different habitats, they eat different foods. DNA evidence suggests these two groups have been reproducing separately for hundreds of thousands of years. They're different species, right? But they can and do produce hybrid offspring in nature. By the way, this is not unusual. Coyotes and gray wolves are different species, but they have interbred. Coyotes on the east coast of North America have a significant amount of DNA, not only from wolves, but also from dogs. There are many examples of hybridization between species. If two groups look alike, we have to work really hard to even know if they have interbred or not. Beyond all of these challenges, this species concept only fits with some types of living things, mainly plants and animals. Lots of living things, including bacteria, reproduce without a partner, so this whole interbreeding metric doesn't work for them. It doesn't work for defining fossil species either. They can't reproduce at all. Species of bacteria and fossils are usually defined by how different they are, measures that can be pretty arbitrary. Bacteria species are defined by differences in their DNA sequences. Fossil species are defined by differences in their anatomy, their age, and where they were found. Scientists in other fields use entirely different definitions. All of this is to say that the best way to define a species depends on what you're studying, what you're trying to do. There is no universal definition. To take a page out of the book of the philosophers, it's actually helpful to stop looking at species as things, and instead look at speciation as a process that generates transient things. Species aren't fixed entities. They change. Evidence from fossils tells us that species that lived in the past were different than the ones that are alive today. Add to this evidence from DNA, anatomy, and embryos, and we know that living things change over time. The world we live in today is just a snapshot in a long evolutionary timeline. Looking from this perspective, we can see that there is not one moment in time where an old species becomes a new, different species, and there's not a moment in time where one species becomes two. In our snapshot of today, some groups are clearly different species. Many others are in the process of speciation. Some groups are even in the process of coming back together. Just as they have in the past, these processes will continue into the future. Some of the boundaries are fuzzy, and that's okay. All of this may leave you wondering, why do we even use the word species at all? There are a lot of reasons why this species concept is important. One is conservation. If we hope to protect a group from habitat destruction or potential extinction, we need to be able to define the group we're trying to protect. Another is that this concept of species helps us and the scientific community to categorize and communicate about groups of living things. When scientists study speciation as a process that is driven by natural selection, they gain insights into some of the biggest issues faced by humankind, like antibiotic resistance, world hunger, and cancer. Instead of getting too caught up in what a species is, you may be better served to focus on the context in which the term is being used. Different contexts call for different definitions.
Okay, guys. So was that video very helpful for you in terms of understanding the different concept of species? Or were you quite confused? Okay, good. So I think it's just to simply put in terms of foundation, what we all understood in the biological aspect is that yes, species is such that they are potentially interbreeding and they produce fertile offspring. But from this video, and hopefully throughout this course, you will realize that definition of species is very different based on the first thing, which is every species is different. The fact that he mentioned for viruses and bacteria and for fossils, the definition of species is very different. And the second part is, what exactly are you studying? Okay, so if in terms that if you're studying cladistics, if you're studying evolutionary science, if you're studying phylogenetics, the definition of species in that aspect is actually very different. So you can actually go to this website. It's just in terms of your understanding of what different species are out there, and you can go to different sites. But the ones that we're most familiar with is biological species concept. But just so you know, and please bear in mind, whenever you're talking about different topics, please be aware of what evolutionary species concept is, cladistics, cohesion, competition, ecological, isolation, phonetic, phylogenetics, recognition species concept, typological, and also genealogical. Okay, there are different definitions out there. All right. So, having bear this in mind also, remember towards the end of the video, he did mention also that when it comes to speciation, there's a time when species starts to really split or in the process of splitting. So, and all of this is back to a certain timeline. So that's why sometimes species actually is very definitive, meaning you can separate one species from another, or sometimes you're in a gray area. So if you were to see on your e-learn, I actually posted a little activity for us to do. So let's try to do it together, yeah? Okay. So the idea of this work is to see whether the species are similar or the same. Okay. And having sort of the take home, one of the take home messages of the video is to always think this in mind. Are they able to interbreed? Do they live in the same habitat? Are there differences in heritable traits? And are there differences in DNA? Of course, there's more to this than just these information, but just things to bear in mind when you're thinking about a species. Okay, so as I mentioned, sometimes it's very definitive, it's either same or different, but sometimes the terms of process of speciation, it can actually fall in the gray areas. All right, so let's try to try out set examples, okay? The first one is about salmon and goldfish. So what they wrote here is, since salmon and goldfish are both fish, they have many traits in common, but there are differences too. They live in different habitats, different food, different behavior, different anatomy, and they never interbreed. Okay, so are they same species or not? What is no? So they're not the same species,
Not
yeah?
same species.
Different species, okay, good. All right, next one. The grizzly bears live in diverse habitats from the northern hemisphere, where they eat wide array of fruit, plants, and meat. Polar bears live in frozen lands to the north, where they roam on ice sheets and hunt seals. The two bears have different anatomy and behavior, and they are broadly considered to be different species. DNA analysis estimates that they diverged from a common ancestor 400,000 years ago. Yet once in a while, at the edges of their ranges, they do meet and interbreed. Using genetic testing, researchers have identified multiple Grola Bre hybrids. So, if you have a grizzly father and a polar bear mother, it becomes a Grola. If it's the other way around, it's a Prizzly hybrid. So from this, the fact that they are able to form hybrids, does that make it similar species or different species? Same genus, different species. Okay. But is it really same genus, different species? If you do a Google search. Same species. Okay, interesting. Same species. Okay. So some of you have put mostly somewhere in between. Okay, interesting. All right. So it's about, okay, so some of you have put around same species and then some around here. Okay, good. Interestingly, these are actually different species. Okay. However, it's not definitive different species, because if it's very different species, there is no way it can interbreed. Okay. So if this towards this end of the spectrum, we know it's different species. But in terms of evolution, is that at some points the ancestors were such that, I mean, the time range for evolution for 400,000 years is not very long in comparison to some by the millions, you see. So that is why there still is that chance of actually producing hybrids. However, by producing hybrids, it doesn't mean that it's actually of the same species. Because in the biological concept of species, it has to be, as I've mentioned, it has to be fertile offsprings. A hybrid, particularly with the concept of, I mean, with this particular species that we're talking about, hybrids usually are unable to form their own offsprings. Just so you know. So like the cases with the tiger and the lion where you form a tigon, yes, exactly, like mules as well. So, which is the hybrid of a donkey and a horse. So in that sense, yes, evolution is such that it's short so much so that they can produce hybrids. So they're not in the extreme spectrum of different species. However, the fact that they actually are anatomically different, habitat difference, there is some to extent they're already different species. All right. Okay, so how about this one? Fly agaric mushrooms. These poisonous mushrooms live in many places around the world. Different populations have different characteristics. Most are red with white spots, but others are yellow, orange, white, tan, or brown. Fly agaric mushrooms reproduce using spores, which can travel by wind across great distances. Because they are isolated, with little chance of interbreeding, populations living on different continents have traditionally been considered different species. Yet, DNA analysis has shown that even populations living in North America from genetically distinct groups. Each group occupies a distinct habitat and alleles do not mix freely. Okay, what do you make of this one? Different species or not different? Or same? They're the same. Okay, yes, it says same. The rest, same. Okay. Same species but different populations. Okay, why do you say same species? Okay, yes, it says now different. Okay. So for those who say same species, can you please tell me what was the keyword that you used to say it's same species? It depends how long. Okay, fine. So now the fact that it didn't quite mention here how long it was isolated, or the fact they don't produce hybrids and all. Okay, so Fatin says, all right, little chances of interbreeding. Okay, so little chances of interbreeding, so that makes it the same species? Is that what you mean, Fatin? But the fact, if they have little chances of interbreeding, if they cannot interbreed, shouldn't it be different species? If you're able to interbreed, then you're the same species. But there's little chances of interbreeding. Thus be the, okay, interesting. All right. Interesting point. Different species because their environments are different, not the same characteristics. Okay, very good, T. Okay, so from all of this, actually some of your keywords here are, because they are isolated with little chance. Okay, I understand where Irdina is coming from. Populations living on different continents have traditionally been considered different. DNA have living in North America have genetically distinct groups. Each group occupies a distinct habitat. Alleles do not mix. The alleles do not mix freely between them. Okay, yes, exactly. So because they do not mix freely, although there's very little chance, although some of you use your keyword here, it actually is more towards different species rather than similar species. There is some gray area, but yes, it's more towards different species because of those keywords. The alleles do not mix freely. Yes. Very tricky, yeah? Yes, but this is just to show that sometimes species is not always definitive. Okay. That's good. Good on you. I like this exchanges of ideas. Now, the common black-tip shark lives in coastal waters around the world. The Australian black-tip shark, which lives off the coast of northern and eastern Australia, looks almost identical to the common black-tip. Though it is smaller, it lives in warmer waters. It has different numbers of vertebrae. Again, look here. Different numbers of vertebrae and has unique genetic markers. But then the other keyword here is looks almost identical. Okay. The two types of sharks were once thought to reproduce only with their own kind. However, using genetic markers, scientists have found dozens of sharks off the coast of Australia that are hybrids between common and Australian blacktips. Okay, so what is your verdict? Definitely different, definitely similar, or somewhat there but different, or somewhat there but more similar? So Afika says same species. Okay, how about the rest? Somewhere in between tapi more similar. Interesting. When you're giving me these answers, can you also back it up with why? What are your keywords that you're using to say if it's similar or different? See, use again. Remember the keywords. Okay, they live off the coast of northern and eastern Australia. Okay, and then looks almost identical. Fine. Smaller, different number of vertebrae, unique genetic markers, reproduce only with their own kind, thought to. But however, using the genetic markers, they have found dozens of sharks, the hybrids. Okay, different quotes sebab tadi doktor kata vertebrate lain. Okay, very good. Similar species because of dozen of hybrids. Okay, don't forget hybrid ni, again, like the tiger and the lion, the grizzly and the polar, the donkey and the horse, they also form hybrids. But are they not different species? And technically, hybrids of, the bigger complex animals, they're usually unable to produce fertilized offsprings. Think about that a bit. A hybrid offspring is unable to actually produce its own generation of species. So think about it. Any more ideas? Okay, so we are perah dah. Okay, so actually it depends on it depends if the shark hybrids are viable. Interesting. Okay, at least to the common knowledge that we have now and based on whatever evidence that is available, they are considered to be different species actually. Okay, not to the extreme range of very different species because of the fact they can still produce hybrids, but the keywords here is they have unique genetic markers, their vertebrae are different. What do you call this? Those two things are the most important keywords. All right. Apa pula Yazid? Yay. Okay. It's very tricky. It's not what do you call this? Straightforward answer. Do you want me to continue on with this and or do you prefer me to continue on with class? Do you want to give these other 4 more a go? Okay, so if I don't receive any comments, that means I assume that last one. Okay, fine. Then the rest you can try yourself. Okay. All right. So we try with the, okay. This one is a tricky one, actually. Okay, I'll try with the coyotes. Coyotes are a wild species related to wolves and dogs. Before about 1900, coyotes lived only in Western North America. As they gradually expanded eastward, the wave of coyotes met and bred with wolves and later dogs, possibly because there weren't many coyote mates to be found. Today, the descendants of these animals known as eastern coyotes, live all over eastern North America, and they mate with other coyotes rather than dogs or wolves. Yet they carry significant number of wolf and dog alleles, which probably contribute to their large size, diverse coat, colors, facial features, and other highly variated traits. Okay, so I know you're going to be all confused with the dog alleles and the wolf alleles, and again, but going back to western and eastern coyotes. This is the west and this is the east. Different species, same species. Interesting, good. Again, backup answers why? Yazid, you always tengah-tengah tau. 1 minute you tukar, 1 minute you tukar. Mana ni? Evidence. Give evidence why. Because they can mate with other dogs. Okay. Okay, interesting. Learning progress. But you need to have a definitive answer. Kenapa? So why do you say so, Yazid? Not definitely different species. Not definitely different species, but somewhat different species. Is that what you mean, Irdina? Okay. So, but you're more towards the different species lah, eh? Okay, but I get Afika coming towards similar because they can mate with dogs, yes. The rest macam mana? Come on. I could be wrong. No, it's nothing, but it's not about a wrong or yes. I like to know your opinions. What do you think? It's not a matter of wrong or right now. It's what are you using as your evidence? Again, remember how I say marine ecology? Every science is evidence-based. What is your evidence here? What are you using to prove your justification here? Takkan lain blur sangat dalam serta ada ni? Okay, different species. Why do you say different species, Nabila? Different species because they can reproduce on their own. Okay. Okay, but see, the keyword here is, today the descendants of these animals, known as the eastern coyotes, live all over eastern North America, and they mate with other coyotes rather than dogs or wolves. Yes, that's the keyword. Yes, that's the keyword, correct. So they're more towards similar species. This is actually just a variation. They may look again, so this is what I want you to bear in mind. The fact that morphologically, of when we call it phonetics, phonetics, they can look very different. But sometimes you need to understand whether those morphological characters are enough to make it a different species, or is it just a variation based on the habitat. But sometimes habitat in the sense that probably because this is colder, and then because they bred with wolves, that's why their coats are thicker. But they didn't say anything about breeding hybrids. They are able to breed. So it's more towards the spectrum of same species. Very good. All right. So this is, again, to give you an idea, a little practice of what to expect when it comes to species. Good on you guys. Okay, so we've run through very quickly about some species concept. I will tap in some of this with you. Okay, so species concepts are, okay, so the models of patterns brought about by the way the evolutionary process works under various conditions. Okay, and the attempts to explain how phonetic variations are compartmentalized. So in terms of however you want to, again, give these different forms of definitions, is really, again, based on how I mentioned when this compartmentalization is looking at the species you're working with and how you want to define things. So you have phonetics, biological species variation, phylogenetics. These are just some. Okay, I showed you like there's a whole lot here you can go through, but let's go through some of the ones here. So phonetic species concept. Species are the smallest group that are consistently and persistently distinct and distinguishable by ordinary means. Strictly operational and non-explanatory concept based on observable facts or similarity and discontinuity. Yes, the definition here is very complex, but basically what phonetic species concept here is about is looking into the morphological characteristics. Okay, something that is very observable and you can see differences in similarity. So when you're doing phonetic species concept, technically you are already applying this when the first thing is when you start collecting your samples and you start sorting out those specimens that you have is based on phonetics or again morphology. Okay, that is what it really means. But then, of course, you know that phonetics is not always helpful because remember in the video, the guy showed a picture of a whole lot of butterflies, but then they mentioned it about being cryptic species, meaning they can all look very similar, but they're actually different species. Or the fact that he showed initially about the squirrels and the oak tree, the different trees. So the oak trees are the similar ones, but the squirrels are different. So it's a good concept. It's the most applicable concept when you first apply because you are sorting things based on what you can see, but don't always believe what you see. Okay. Then next one is biological or reproductive species concept. This is the one that you guys are very familiar with. It's basically having to sexually reproduce and able to provide a fertile offspring. Okay, this one, phylogenetics, I'm going to be playing around with this with you in our marine ecology third lab. So you'll be using a mega software just to play around with phylogenetics. But for phylogenetics, a species are a single lineage of an ancestry descendant population that maintains its identity from other such lineages and has its own evolutionary tendencies and historical fate. Okay, so the thing with phylogenetics, what makes it different from biological aspect is that again, whether you're looking at morphological phylogeny or genetics, okay, and what it really looks at is that you have the concept. The other keyword that it takes into account is ancestor descendants. So when you look at just normal taxonomy, it's sorting out the different species based on the morphology. But what phylogenetics looks at is looking at the relationship and how it would have evolved at some stage. Okay, sometimes phylogenetic doesn't really look at evolution, but it looks as the ancestor descendant relationship. Okay, if more specifically to evolutionary species concept, then it looks into evolution based on a proper timeline. And this one sometimes is better looked at in terms of the genealogy. So that's why you have all the different genetic markers. That one is able to tell of the work better. So it is favored by biologists, but has the disadvantage that lineage affiliation cannot be unequivocally proven without time travel. So meaning to say that, again, phylogenetics, again, it's evidence-based. It's based on what evidence is available. But you cannot take it as the fact. That is why it's just a concept, okay? If it is a fact, that means it's considered to be the truth and nothing else, anybody who says anything else is wrong. You cannot say that. The whole framework of the phylogeny tree can actually change if you have more evidence. Okay, so remember how in my first lecture I mentioned at some stage hippopotamus and also whales were actually related because they actually came from a similar ancestry, but then at one point diverged. So again, it might seem like this sounds so crazy. How does it even work that way? But it's whatever evidence based on their fossil records, looking at their bone structure, looking at embryology. So that is what brought it into that. Okay, so that's the one thing that you need to understand. And of course, this can only be proven if you travel back into time and you see that thing happening before your very eyes, then of course it makes sense. But right now, again, whatever is available. So far with my explanation, are we okay? Or do you have any questions at this point? Okay, good. So if I don't receive any questions, then I go on. So then, of course, you have the ecological species concept. Species are lineages or sets of closely related lineages occupying minimally different adaptive zones. So basically here, when it comes to the species concept, this is more favored by ecologists, where they are looking into the aspect of the habitat and how, of course, the habitat produces its own environment to produce different species. Okay, species can be explained but not defined by the zones they inhabit. So okay, this one is tricky because yes, you cannot define example, like remember how I told you about there are some certain species where, okay, like say for the polar bear and the grizzly bear, they are different habitats. But how about, say, example, the different coyotes? So if you want to define, this species is such that it's this habitat and this habitat, we cannot take it strictly in that matter. It is something to consider in terms of the ecology, but you cannot just strictly define species based on a different habitat. I hope you understand what I mean by this definition. Species can be explained. Again, the word here, it can explain, but not defined by the zones. That is what it means here. Good? Are we clear? Good. Okay. Cohesion species concept. Good. Species are the most inclusive population of individuals having the potential for phenotypic cohesion mechanism. Now, a lot of you might be sort of cracking your head. What about cohesion? Okay. Cohesion is the most inclusive group of organisms. So they have the potential for genetic or demographic exchangeability, meaning to say that the group is very inclusive that they can actually exchange genetic traits. Okay. A group of these organisms have the potential for phenotypic cohesion to intrinsic mechanisms. So meaning to say, in this case, this concept is more applicable for asexual groups like for bacteria, viruses, okay, because it's a lot more. Some ways their groups is less complex, okay, and it's how am I to mention? There's more potential for it to actually to define it based on this small genetic exchangeability, rather than and phenotype also in some ways because it's less complex. All right, so this is what cohesion is about. All right, so for any further reading, I would actually recommend you going to this site. I usually type Evolutionary 101. It also gives a lot of teaching modules for evolution and other aspects of speciation and whatnot. So this is where I get some of my materials, and I'm happy for you to venture and look at their types of case studies, just for that you have a better understanding of the work. All right.